take a few moments to breathe. And breathe deeply through your nostrils, and then exhale gently through your parted lips. And on the inhalation, draw in the air as deeply as you can into the belly. Let your belly extend out away from your backbone like a bellows, like a balloon. Let it distend. Let your entire core just relax. Let the belly loose. Let your center of gravity deepen, sinking lower in your torso with each breath. And now feel your feet flat on the floor. And while continuing to breathe deeply, drawing that breath deep into the belly, feel the force of gravity pulling on your feet. Feel your connection with the earth. Feel the lines of force moving from the very center of the planet all the way up into your feet, drawing you to itself. Feel that while you're breathing. You should start to feel a warming in your feet, almost a tingling, as the magnetic forces of Earth are drawn up into your body, through the soles of your feet, through the centers and the arches of each foot. And now that we have felt the depth of breath and the deep centering of it, and we have felt the magnetic forces of Earth being drawn up into our body, even as the gravitational forces are pulling us down, connecting us with the core of the planet. Now, with each breath, let spirit and light pour through an opening at the top of your head. And let that spirit and that light rush to meet the magnetic and gravitational forces meeting in your belly as you breathe. And let's chant the Om. Good evening. Have any of you done that before? Working with magnetic forces, bringing the light and spirit in through the crown, letting them meet, working together in the breath, in the belly. It's a good practice. It's a good practice for all sorts of reasons on all sorts of levels. So, something to play with. So I've been reading In the Garden by Murshid Samuel Lewis, our friend. And in this section, he has been talking about the practice of spiritual walking and learning how to do that. And I want to read a couple paragraphs that he has to say subsequent to his discussion about walking. This is actually moving away from the topic of walking into the topic of breath and centering. It is unwise to practice with the centers in the head for the purpose of walk until one has practiced with at least the hara center. That's what we were just doing, that deep abdomen breathing. This gives balance. Sufism constantly emphasizes balance, but the mentally minded people think that if they have these words and these thoughts, they have something. They have nothing until they are able to control centers and not be controlled by them. Knowledge of breath is important. It may even be more important than centering. Centering has a glamour, which breathing does not. Yet breathing is fundamental to life. We cannot live without it, so the pupil should certainly practice hara, and then, when the hold of hara is very great, under wise guidance, head centering may be tried. But if not, then heart centering. For after all, the heart center is near the center of the body, and also, in the unseen, it is near the center of personality. This would suggest that there is centering in the abdomen, a centering in the head, and a centering in the thorax near the heart, and each has its purpose. But as people are weak mostly, they have to begin with hara. After they are strong, they can practice with heart centering, and there is no end to advantage. This is the last paragraph. It's short, and it's the zinger. Okay. Head centering is mostly needed to increase joy, bliss, lightness, rising above the denseness of earth and material mindedness. But one should not become the slave of it. One is not necessarily more spiritual because one becomes more ethereal. That last sentence. One is not necessarily more spiritual because one becomes more ethereal. And yet, I would suggest that most people, if they're on a spiritual path, see that kind of blissed out state as the goal. This is an indication that we're doing things right? That we're transcending the mundane, we're transcending the physical. We are entering into a transcendental, elevated state in which there is peace and bliss and harmony. What's not to like about that, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. And he says, well, one should not become a slave of it. Lama Surya Das, in his book, Make Me One with Everything, calls it being a bliss junkie. And he sees it as a problem, a potential pitfall that people have, especially when they're new to the practice of meditation and the spiritual life, is that they start to feel this and that's all they want. Go for that, that's the goal, right? So if that isn't the goal, if that isn't the kind of spiritual experience that we are looking for, that we want to pursue, then what is? Because that all sounds like pretty good stuff, right? Okay. So the purpose of reading this wasn't to get everybody on the bandwagon with a breathing technique, necessarily, but to get to that last sentence of that last paragraph. Right? And so we hear repeated over and over again in the Bodhisattva vow and in other forms of that we seek enlightenment for the liberation of all sentient beings. This is a vow of service. This is why we do what we're doing, so that we can serve more effectively. Not so that we can be blissed out, not so that we can have personal growth even, but that we can be prepared to be channels, more perfect channels, through which the great Creator can work. The Father, Mother, Creator of all that is, can extend itself through us more perfectly. And if, this Creator is so all perfect, then you would think that it could extend itself through us no matter what, and that's probably true, but I know that the requirement is laid upon our shoulders to be conscious co-creators with that force, with that consciousness, to participate in the process, not to just be dumb extensions of it, right? in so doing, we then begin to traverse the way. When the Christ said, I am the way, when the Tao, we're talking about something that is universal and eternal and that carries the individual from a state of animal identity, animal consciousness, to a state of godly consciousness. Know ye not that ye are gods, right? And none of that can be done on a learning level. It's not something that we can pass out little tracts and say, here, memorize this and you'll get it, right? Yeah. And so we have, as an example of that kind of consciousness, the statement that we refer to periodically in the Epistle of John, that these things we know for a certainty, we know it so definitely that we can say it unequivocally, that God is light and in God there is no darkness at all. Period, end of story. Right? So to me, that's the experience that transcends the mind, that transcends beliefs, that transcends thought patterns, that transcends my own personal bliss and my own personal growth, for that matter. It's I'm being brought into an already existent place, not something I had to grow in, or become, but something that was already present. Okay. With that, everything that we do then can be part of this liberation of all sentient beings, and without that, nothing can be. Okay? So there's no gray area in between. With it, walking, going to the bathroom is a blessing for the earth, for everyone. With that awareness. And without it, kneeling at the altar, praying, having communion, whatever it is that we ascribe to a spiritual life, a display of our spirituality, is meaningless. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and say that it has been said that Jesus took on the sins of the world, or that Christ died for our sins, took on the sins of the world, right? Okay, lots to talk about there. First of all, the whole concept of sin, I keep telling you every time I approach this, and we'll talk about that later. Well, this is probably later now. We'll talk about what sin is. The term sin comes from a Greek term that was used for in archery. And it was literally meant missing the target or missing the mark. That's the word. So we would call that sin. I can't tell you what it is in Greek. But it was specifically an archery term. You missed the mark. No, nothing punitive about that. Nothing condemning. nothing that says you are going to rot in smoldering hell of some kind because of that. It just said, you missed the mark. Try again, right? And we know that everything that we do builds up a certain energy and a certain momentum to it. It has its own, takes on its own life. That's why habits are habits, right? We have habitual ways of thinking, habitual ways of doing things. You know, they took on a life of their own because of the repetition of the thing. And so if we have a repetitive missing the mark, then it becomes really easy for us to continue to miss the mark. We get stuck in a rut over and over again doing that. And teachers, for as long as there have been teachers, spiritual teachers, have worked with their students in this way. And, you know, in the Eastern traditions, they would talk about taking on the student's karma, in part or all or whatever, helping carry the load, helping de-energize that habit, the momentum, that energetic momentum that was established by this continual missing the mark. Here, let me help you with that, right? So then we hear about the Christ, through Jesus, taking on the sins of the world, which is now, we're understanding it as the accumulated momentum of missing the mark by millions or billions of people over countless eons of time. So, you know, so if you have a habit and you catch it right away, when it's still a young habit, it's easier to correct, right? But if you've been unconsciously doing the same thing for years, and then all of a sudden you realize, you know what, I want to stop this, this is a bad habit, it's hard because it's so ingrained. It's ingrained on the cellular level. It's part of how you relate to life force. That's what addiction is, right? And it's a pattern that's established in our atmosphere through which the life force must be channeled. It channels through that pattern in our atmosphere in a very specific way, and we become accustomed to receiving the life force in that very specific way, in that doctored way that happened as it passes through these patterns in our atmosphere. And so there are chemicals and drugs that make that happen real quickly, right? But the biggest drug is the collective thinking of the planet. It's seductive, it's addictive. We don't know that we're influenced by it, and yet it colors everything and mandates that we receive life through a very specific format. And if we remove that format or mess with that format at all, then the body goes through a period of withdrawal. The mind goes through a period of panic and withdrawal, right? This is what happens when you begin to step out on a spiritual path, right? Okay. So we have the Christ taking on the sins of the world, this accumulated momentum of bad habit, right? Counterproductive ways of thinking and being, and saying, let me help you with that. Let me help carry that. Let me help diffuse that. So how do we participate in this process? Now, if we're talking about wanting to do all that we're talking about wanting to do, for the liberation of all sentient beings. Liberation from what? Well, that's what the liberation is from, right? From that addiction. If we're wanting to aid in the liberation of all sentient beings, then how do we participate with the Christ in this process of taking on the sins of the world? Because we were told, the things that I do, so shall you do, and also greater things than these. That wasn't just, hey, watch this, I can walk on water, and maybe you will be able to too sometime. It's this, it's you have to also take on the sins of the world, right? So we're confronted with what our relationship to those sins are. And so let's use an example or two. Racism is a particularly ugly human tendency. It's part of tribalism. It stems from our sense of separation and that the other must, by definition, be dangerous and so on. So if I say to you, I'm not a racist, then I'm basically saying, oh, I'm not a sinner. But Jesus, there's some stories about that, you know. The person who says, I'm not a sinner, walks away feeling justified in themselves and holy in themselves, but they're missing the boat. Whereas the other person who comes and smites their chest and says, you know, mea culpa, have mercy upon me, a sinner, and is in touch with and feels their own, quote, sinfulness. Okay, I'm getting into real dangerous territory here with all these words. They're the ones that can actually be healed of that it can be brought into balance, right? So there's a funny thing that happens. The mind wants to go on guilt trips, and the mind of the planet wants to encourage us to do that because it's a punitive modality we live in. We think of God as a punisher. We think of our parents as punishers. We think of the legal system as punitive. Penitentiary is based on that idea, right? Penitence, punitive. But there's nothing punitive in the universe. There's nothing that I've ever encountered that is anything but, here, let me help you carry that load. Here, let me show you a better way. With patience and love and understanding, compassion, right? So rather than saying, I'm not a racist, which, you know, it's real tempting to say, because I don't believe in racism, and I could point to certain aspects of my life that would support the fact that I'm not a racist. But if I say, wait a minute, I'm part and parcel of this mind of the planet. It doesn't exist apart from me. As a matter of fact, my belief system is built around the idea that quite the opposite is true. There's such an interconnectedness, and we are so bound together and have been co-creating the conditions of our existent reality on all these different levels, including what I can point out around me as racism and bigotry and sexism and misogyny and on and on. I can point those out, and the moment I can, I have to say, ooh, I did that. I did that. How else can I bring that to the light? How else can that become transformed in me by this overwhelming realization that God is light and in God there is no darkness at all, if I don't have that to work with? So I take that on and I feel it. I feel penetrated by it. I feel the prick of it in me, and I allow that to be healed. Again and again and again, because there's a tsunami of minds out there that are also at work, reinforcing this antiquated belief system that they're all addicted to. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Right? They can't help it. So there's no condemnation in that. But I want to help them with this burden. And so I'll take that on. I'll feel my own racism. And I will bring that to the light. Knowing that because we're all connected, I've helped to ease the burden and make it easier for others. Incrementally, I don't know. It's above my pay grade to know how effective that is on each individual basis, but I do know that it is what we've got to do. That's what we're called to do. I think I've told you this before, but I was in the infantry in Vietnam, and although I never had anyone in my sights when I was pulling a trigger, I was there participating in this game, and fully, even at that time, which I was pretty much of a knothead still. I know, it's hard to believe. I said I was pretty much of a knothead still. Even at that time, I instinctively knew that I needed to own everyone's guilt that had ever pulled a trigger with somebody in the sights. So every body that we encountered was a body that I felt I had done. I knew that I had to do that. It was part of my spiritual awakening, along with the opening of my sight and a variety of things that were happening in the jungle, right? With no context other than I'm in the jungle and starting to see auras. But because of that, and I believe that this is really true for me, and I'm trying not to extrapolate this to everyone who has had PTSD, I never dealt with that. I never came back and had those kind of experiences because I feel for me, it was, I already dealt with it. I owned it. There was nothing swept under the carpet with this thing. I'd already said yeah to it. Sorry, I'm doing this, and I feel the pain and the prick of it. Okay. And please understand, I'm not telling you that because I was some super person, because that had nothing to do with me. That was a gift that was given to me to understand that was what I needed to do. That's a gift that I feel we need to grasp and embrace as servants of the way. To take on the sins of the world, right? to let those things be transformed and transmuted in us, so that we can walk away from that transmutation experience, saying God is light and in God there is no darkness at all. Right? Okay. Any questions about this? Comments? This is a slippery slope, talking about all this, because it's real easy for people to slip into the old age, the Piscean age concept of guilt and punishment and remorse and, you know, there's a lot more to say about sin than just what I did about missing the mark, right? But it's important that no matter what it is, however we're looking at the idea of, you know, karmic indebtedness, or however you want to look at all that, it is the same kind of mechanism. And none of it has to do with punishment and guilt and finger pointing and holier than thou and all that nonsense that people have heaped onto the whole thing. Look what we have done with the original sin. That's why women suffer in childbirth, you know, because they tempted Adam with an apple and listened to that damn serpent, and we're all suffering because of that. Right? And so there's a great example, you know. That had nothing to do with any story other than this is what happens when a soul incarnates as it's moving through the planes of existence into physical manifestation. And that sin, that original sin of taking on and partaking of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of duality, right, of polarization. It's just a good example. It's a description of that. And we go, oh yeah, women bad. So. Okay, so we have this thing called the way, and we talk about the way as being a path of sequential initiatory experiences that we go through as a soul, self, that we go through as a body incarnated, that we that there's a certain similarity, a sameness. It's almost formulaic from person to person, what they go through as they march through these chambers of inner initiation. And yet, having said that, each experience is still beautifully, mysteriously unique to each one of us. And it's the fact that that path exists, that way exists, that is the reason that we don't want to get caught up in the trap of being addicted to bliss. Because that then becomes what we're all about. Ah, yes. I am centered. I am this. Right. And because that's what we want to be blissed out, and we want to feel that peace, and we want to feel that transcendental state, disconnected from material concerns and the material plane. We instinctively know that we have to shy away from or run away from anything that is going to disturb our wa. That means our peace, our equanimity. And there's nothing quite like walking the way to really mess up your day. So if you're looking for that peace and that transcendental state and all that, there's a part of you that's going to say, I can do that. There's a way to do this kind of little end run around that and start working with centers in the head, you know, and never have this other thing happening that challenges, that places me in this crucible, the retort with the fire blazing underneath it, reducing things to their primal matter, their primal substance, not things reducing me to it, to this juice. This, yeah. So all of a sudden, when we hear that Bodhisattva vow about we seek enlightenment, I seek enlightenment for the sake of for the sake of liberating all sentient beings, that takes on some more import. It means that there's going to be a tough row to hoe on that. It means that we're going to have to own things that we don't necessarily feel we've owned, you know. All the nonsense, all the bad behavior, all the missing the mark, all the evil doing, you know, that's going on. It's not going to get fixed unless we do that. By we, I'm not talking about just us, all of us who have ever been on the planet, who have followed the way of light, right? That have allowed that light to become their all, and who have found within that ambient field of light within themselves the source of that light, their own being, the great self. That, then, is the philosopher's stone. Right. That will transmute the base metals into spiritual gold. And the base metals is exactly what we're talking about, right? Okay. Now any questions? Okay.
I think I have a question.
Okay.
I'm still kind of trying to formulate it.
And can you speak up loud enough so that this will pick you up?
Well, you need to repeat the question.
I'm terrible at repeating the questions. So yeah, go ahead. Let's not even, just go ahead.
In my experience of owning humanity's missing the mark and my own missing the mark, there's often a lot of shame that comes with that. And I know that that's in itself missing the mark, right? But is so potent sometimes. And I guess I'm wondering how you work with that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. So I really tried to present this in this high-minded kind of a way because I wanted to steer away from guilt and that without opening up this topic of how important that feeling of personal responsibility and your part in it is. Owning it isn't a mental exercise. It's not like saying, okay, I'm going to have to say that I'm a racist in order for me to help other people who are really racists. Right? You have to actually experience what you are doing that's making that reality. And so if in that moment of experiencing it, if you are not pricked by that, that's what I kept using that word very advisedly, if you're not pricked by that, then you didn't do it yet. Wallowing in it and making that your religion is not where we're supposed to go with it. So yeah. So the more empathetic that people are, the more that they will be able to connect with that feeling, that energy, that event, that attitude that is prevalent around them, internalize it, be wounded by it, and then transmute that.
That's the piece I want to know how you do that.
The transmuting. Okay, so that's a really big topic, which is actually why I started having you and Kent in at the altar with me last Sunday. Okay, because that is what communion is. There's nothing. It's nothing if not transmutation. It's alchemy. That is it. You're taking matter, molecular matter, and allowing it to be transfused by and transmuted by this other thing, the spirit and living light, so that it then becomes, when you have the eyes to see, more than it was, different than it was a moment before. See? That's what we do. You are the elevated chalice. So there's an experience that people have when they're learning how to do the communion, and we encourage people to learn how to do a communion at their own altars, at their own homes. They don't have to have a church, they don't have to be robed up and doing all sorts of things, but they need to understand what that moment feels like when they are reaching up and asking for and allowing this thing to happen that flows in, and it's because you have yearned for it and opened up for it, and you extended yourself. And in the samurai movie, Toshiro Mifune said in one of the samurai trilogy, the sword is the soul, right? The chalice is the soul. We feel that there's a connection there. If it's just going through motions, that's not it. It's not like everybody can grab a cup and do that, and by virtue of the fact that they said the words and raised it up, that'll happen. There's something that has to happen on the level of consciousness that does it, before and after to that. That's when we know then that on the altar of our heart, we have brought this thing, this pain, this event, this guilt, this whatever you want. We placed it on the altar of our heart and we raised it up and said, let this be transmuted into the living light of the Christ. And it is. And we feel it. We know it. We walk away from it without a doubt. See? Then we start to participate in the work. That's what is known then as the great work. Now we're not just saying, well, let your light shine and it's going to somehow affect everybody around us. It does that, but when we're going to be conscious workers in the vineyard, we're learning how to use these tools in a way that is way more effective than merely breezing through a crowded room, allowing our magnificence to elevate people. Don't mean that. I don't want to downplay it that much. That's really an important part of what we do. Right? Make room for the living light to manifest, to glow around you, to permeate your atmosphere, and that becomes the dominant vibratory magnet. It demands that everything around it succumb to it. Okay? Or leave. Or leave the vicinity. All right. But this process of working with that light then, and having that connection with the light, which is why from day one I say it's really, really important for you to feel the light. Not just understand it as a form of energy that exists on a vibratory realm that is within our ocular range of perception, and that you can feel it as something that is alive and has consciousness, has personality. We're talking about the light is the flesh of the Word, the Christos, the Logos. So if you want to say that the Logos, and I'm not going to say this, but it's sort of like this, if you want to say that that's the Om, the sound of creation that reverberates through time and space, that creates time and space, and then you say, and what's the first manifestation of that? It's light. It's the flesh of the Word, right? So this being that we call the Christ exists beyond that, is that, and creates all that is with that light. In God there is only light. Okay. So there's a reality to the term "be a priest unto yourself," and that's this business about learning how to work with these forces of nature, of life, that you're part of, and doing so in a conscious way, and working with them in your own spiritual journey. And so you have an authority. The power of the Word is in you that brings things into manifestation or slays them in you. This will live and this will not. In yourself, as a priest unto yourself. That's for everybody. That's on everybody's agenda. If you look in the syllabus, it's there. Might be towards one of the last chapters, but it's definitely there. You know. Then there's another kind of ordination or kind of priesthood that exists that takes that same authority that we have individually and said, and I will work through you, even though you're not perfected.
Who's you?
Huh? To an aspirant, you know, to say, I will work through you in order to accomplish these same things that you can do personally as a priest unto yourself. You can now do that because of how I'm going to work through you for other people. You'll help me, the Christ says, do this for other people. You can help them by using that same word, that power of the word to give life to or to diminish things that they're dealing with. You know, to help them overcome obstacles. Well, just put it that way. As a soul. So hopefully, in not too long, you'll get a chance to witness an ordination like that here, and get a sense of what is being imparted to that individual at the time, you know. And the beauty of that is that you can then get a better understanding of what that means for you internally. Oh, I too am cloaked from infinity to infinity, cloaked in royal purple. I too can have the power and authority over the life and the death of creation. My word too can be effective. Right? And without those vows, without the humility and the obedience, none of that's going to come into your lap, because you have to prove yourself trustworthy to be given those kinds of things to work with. And so, thankfully, when we're still fumbling around in the dark and half asleep, and we're not even given that authority very effectively for our own lives. Because if we really got juiced up and connected to the source of all power and life and let it run through our runaway thinking the way that we normally do, and all of our thoughts are things, they're prayers that manifest. And if you hook them to that higher power, they're going to manifest even more powerfully. So thank God that doesn't happen. And we're saying, okay, well, we'll give you enough so that you can breathe and navigate through your day. And if you can prove that you're learning these things, we'll keep adding a little bit more. You get a little bit more, a little bit more. He who is faithful in little shall receive great things, right? Greater things. That's the way it happens, you know. So, now did I mess up anybody? Okay. Well, let's close with a prayer. O great and nameless one, we do give thanks for the holy way as it has manifested here on earth through Christ Jesus and through Christ Mary. We give thanks for these way showers, our elder brother and sister, and ask for and eagerly accept their aid and guidance as our teachers. So let it be. Glory unto God, glory unto the Christ, and glory unto the Holy Spirit. And so it is done. Amen.